Opening shot. Fog crawls along a narrow, cobblestone street in 1873 New Orleans. Gas lamps flicker, casting uneven pools of light over slick stones. A shadow moves across a balcony, disappearing behind a curtain. A faint, unsettling whisper trails through the night air. Narrator low, commanding. In a house on Royal Street, a young kitchen slave vanished without a trace. Some say she walked away. Others say she never left. But what emerged from her silence would haunt the city for decades. Cut to the mansion's dim kitchen. Copper pots hang like silent sentinels, their surfaces dull and worn. A wooden spoon rests beside a cracked ceramic bowl. The air smells faintly of herbs and burnt sugar. The camera lingers on a single, small hand, violets, brushing against the countertop, pausing, as if feeling the house itself. Narrator. Her name was Violet. Quiet, unremarkable, invisible, and yet, she observed everything. The cruelty of the wealthy, the fear of the servants, the secrets that thrived behind locked doors. She learned patience, she learned silence, and she learned the subtle art of revenge. Audio. Soft, irregular ticking, a distant piano note, the sound of water dripping into a copper basin. Narrator. The world never listened to women like her. The city never noticed what happened behind closed doors. And the mansion, polished and proud, was about to learn a truth it could not escape. This is the story of Violet, whose vengeance was patient, precise, and invisible. Screen fades to black. A single word appears. Violet. The mansion stood at the corner of Royal and Conti, its iron balconies curling like watchful fingers over the street. By day, it gleamed with painted shutters and polished brass, a monument to wealth, civility, and unspoken proprieties. By night, however, the walls exhaled whispers, soft groans of secrets buried behind lace curtains and painted smiles. The city's elite traversed its halls in measured steps, never noticing the kitchens below, where the world's darker truths simmered alongside broths and sauces. Violet moved quietly among them, her hands carrying bowls heavier than her own body, her eyes absorbing every gesture, every whispered command. She had learned to read people like a language, how a tightened jaw betrayed guilt, how the faintest twitch of a hand concealed fear, how a smile could mask cruelty. Her position as a kitchen slave gave her access to the inner workings of the household that no visitor could fathom. The wine cellars, the servants' corridors, the attic rooms where secrets gathered dust. All belonged to her, if only she had the courage to claim them. It was in these moments, surrounded by copper pots and the warm smell of roasting meats, that Violet first understood the concept of patience as weapon. Those who wielded power thought it was absolute. They underestimated the quiet, the unseen, the obedient. Yet every detail she collected, who drank from which cup, which foods were poisoned with their subtle prejudices, which threats were whispered at night, would later serve as a ledger of vengeance. By sunset, the mansion's laughter faded into shadows. The chandeliers swayed above silent hallways where no servant dared linger. Violet could hear the faintest sigh, the creak of a floorboard not yet discovered. And she would remember each one. Violet's true education came not from orders but from observation. She watched the children of the household, their manners practiced, their smiles rehearsed, their cruelty inherited. She noticed how the mother, a woman draped in lace and perfumes, would tighten her lips when confronted by a servant's question. The father, a man of business and unspoken violence, would leave marks, emotional or otherwise, on those beneath him, marks Violet catalogued carefully in her mind. The kitchen, ostensibly a place of service, became her laboratory. Every ingredient, every spice was a tool of knowledge. She learned which herbs dulled minds, which liquids dulled pain, which powders could dissolve the will of a person over time. She did not act out of malice. She acted from necessity. History, she understood, had never listened to women like her. Her mother had whispered cautionary tales of betrayal, of justice denied. Violet internalized these lessons with the precision of a surgeon, turning fear into strategy, silence into leverage. Evenings were the most dangerous. Candles cast long shadows, and servants whispered rumors of disappearances. Workers who had gone missing, children who had grown pale and hollow. Violet would nod politely, never revealing the depth of her understanding. She had learned the most important lesson. Power is invisible. A raised voice alerts, a glare provokes, a scream betrays. But quiet observation, patient calculation, and precise action could change the course of lives. And she was learning fast. It began with small things. A forgotten spoon in the sugar jar, a teaspoon of bitter herbs slipped into a stew, the faintest trace of anise in the tea. Violet's victims were never chosen at random. They were selected according to cruelty, arrogance, and hypocrisy. And always, she watched for the subtle signs. The hesitation of a tongue, the slight flinch when biting into a morsel, the way a hand trembled before the body finally succumbed. New Orleans whispered rumors. Servants spoke of sickness that struck without reason, of children growing pale in the night, of illnesses that seemed to prefer certain tables and certain guests. Yet the family laughed, blaming fate or the climate or the city itself. They never looked beneath their own opulence, never questioned the innocuous bowls served in golden trays. Violet became a shadow in their world, invisible but omnipresent, delivering justice as precisely as a scalpel. And yet, even as her power grew, so did her fear. The mansion had eyes everywhere. Loyal servants, hidden chambers, and the ever-watchful gaze of the city's clergy. One wrong move could cost her life. But Violet understood a truth that others could not. True vengeance is patient. It does not rage. It waits. It observes. And it delivers the punishment that the world refused to mete out. The mansion was not merely a home. It was a cathedral of hidden corruption. Behind the polished floors and gilded mirrors, each room was a repository of sins carefully catalogued by its occupants. The parents' secrets, theft, bribery, affairs, layered the walls like peeling wallpaper. The children absorbed these sins as lessons in entitlement. Violet watched it all, memorizing the patterns, the timings, the whispers that revealed the family's true hierarchy of power. Even the furniture seemed complicit. Chairs that creaked at the wrong moment, doors that groaned in warning, and mirrors that reflected more than just faces. They reflected guilt, fear, and expectation. Violet learned to read the objects as she read people. A dropped candlestick could signal anger. A misaligned painting could signal distress. Her eyes absorbed the minutiae, storing every detail for the inevitable reckoning. It was here that Violet understood the full measure of institutional complicity. The city, the clergy, the police, they all looked away when convenient. They had no eyes for the kitchen, for the servant corridors, for the small lives existing in service of luxury. She was invisible to them, but invisibility, she realized, was power. And power, wielded with patience, could become vengeance. Outside the mansion, New Orleans churches glimmered with sanctity, their steeples piercing the humid night sky. Yet within, corruption festered. Clergy preached salvation while ignoring abuse, silencing cries behind confessional doors. Violet learned that sanctity was performative, morality negotiable. The church protected the wealthy, ignored the poor, and demanded obedience. Violet observed the rituals, the processions, the whispered deals made under the guise of piety. She catalogued everything. Which priests accepted bribes, which nuns turned a blind eye, which parishioners concealed criminality behind smiles and candles. The mansion and the church were part of the same ecosystem, feeding each other's power. And within this ecosystem, Violet existed like a ghost, a silent judge gathering evidence, preparing for justice that the world refused to dispense. Orphanages dotted the French Quarter, grimy facades masking desperation and neglect. Violet had been told stories as a girl, how the unwanted were discarded, how children learned cruelty from being treated as less than human. Some of these children had ended up in the mansion, either as servants or as silent witnesses to the family's cruelty. Violet moved carefully among them, learning who could be trusted and who would betray secrets for scraps. She offered subtle guidance, feeding information into a mental ledger of power and weakness. Children who whispered of late-night abuses, who spoke of sudden illnesses, who noticed faces in windows where none should have been. All became part of Violet's growing map of vengeance. She treated them gently but deliberately, aware that one wrong move could destroy the fragile trust she had built. By 1875, Violet had become a master of subtlety. Every meal she prepared carried not only nourishment but potential consequences. She had studied plants, powders, and syrups that could sicken or subtly influence behavior. Her knowledge was not magical but meticulous, a science born of observation, survival, and the hunger for justice denied to her ancestors. The mansion's elite, blinded by privilege, never suspected that the sweet-smelling custard or the golden-hued soup contained lessons of morality that could not be taught otherwise. Violet's acts were not merely revenge. They were statements. Each dish delivered a verdict, each flavor a judgment. And in the quiet aftermath, when her victims whispered prayers and curses alike, Violet remained unseen, unblinking, patient. It was a humid August night when the first prominent guest vanished. Laughter had filled the dining room. The chandeliers cast playful shadows over porcelain dishes and silverware. Violet served her course with a practiced smile. No one noticed the faint bitter trace of her careful preparation. Within hours, the man was gone. His absence ignored initially, explained away as a sudden trip or a fever. But Violet's map of knowledge grew. She catalogued reactions, noting who expressed concern and who remained indifferent. The mansion's sense of order frayed beneath her quiet interventions. Fear began to creep into hallways, unspoken but palpable. Every glance carried suspicion. Every cough or pallor became a silent signal. And Violet, ever silent, ever observant, understood the power she now wielded. The ability to erase existence without the world ever noticing. By 1876, the mansion itself seemed alive with the consequences of Violet's quiet vengeance. Servants whispered in corners, afraid of making eye contact with anyone. Doors that once opened with ease now groaned under unseen tension. The family began to notice a shift, a subtle unease, a weight pressing on their shoulders, but they could not identify its source. Violet moved through the hallways like a shadow, her presence imperceptible yet commanding. She had learned to time every step, every action with precision. The mansion's inhabitants were trapped within a theater of her making, performing as if nothing had changed while fear slithered beneath their polished manners. And outside, the city remained blind, oblivious to the small, deliberate collapses of order happening behind gilded walls. The children, once oblivious, began to notice the disappearances. Their laughter turned brittle. Their games slowed as a pall of suspicion settled over them. Violet observed without interference, understanding that fear, once planted, could grow more powerful than poison. Some of the children spoke in hushed tones, recounting details their parents would have dismissed. Violet listened, catalogued, and weighed every word. In them, she saw both vulnerability and insight. The mansion, for all its wealth and grandeur, had created its own witnesses. Eyes that saw beyond appearances, ears attuned to what adults pretended not to hear. She realized that vengeance was not simply about punishment, it was about revelation. Meanwhile, the city's clergy remained willfully ignorant. Violet observed priests blessing meals and parishioners, offering sermons about sin and redemption, never questioning the abuses unfolding just beyond stained glass windows. Corruption had become ritualized, a silent conspiracy of omission. Violet understood this complicity. The church was a force both moral and political, its influence protecting the powerful while condemning the powerless. Her work in the kitchen, though hidden, began to intersect with this larger structure of control. Every act of subtle sabotage was a challenge to the authority that had ignored her, her family, and countless others. Violet's methods grew more sophisticated. She learned not only to sicken but to terrify. A dish might carry a flavor that triggered memory, guilt, or paranoia. Guests who had once laughed loudly now twisted uneasily in their chairs, sensing invisible hands tightening around their lives. She became an alchemist of emotion. Each meal, each sip was an experiment in psychological torment. And yet, Violet never overplayed her hand. Subtlety was the key. Fear, when delivered quietly, silently, penetrated deeper than any scream could. The mansion trembled under her invisible hand, its opulence a fragile mask for the horrors simmering beneath. Rumors began to circulate outside the mansion. Guests disappeared, servants fell ill, and whispers of curses and divine retribution spread through New Orleans' narrow streets. Yet no evidence ever surfaced. Violet's acts were surgical, her timing impeccable. She left no trace, only consequence. The mansion's halls carried an almost audible tension, as if the building itself had learned to watch. Violet had become not just a servant but a specter, an architect of unseen terror. Each disappearance, each subtle act of retribution, carved a deeper path into the minds of the living. The city remained unaware, yet the mansion's heart had begun to rot, not from neglect, but from the slow, inevitable pull of justice administered in silence. By 1877, the mansion was no longer a symbol of wealth. It had become a cage of terror. The family's composure cracked under the weight of uncertainty. Servants hesitated, afraid to speak, afraid to act, afraid to look. Every glance at a door, every creak of floorboard, reminded them that the world they knew was no longer in control. Violet moved like a conductor, orchestrating fear with invisible hands. Every disappearance had been deliberate, every subtle illness planned, every reaction catalogued. The family tried to hold together, but tension fractured their carefully cultivated facades. Paranoia seeped into their conversations, their laughter now hollow, each word measured against unseen eyes. The father, sensing something amiss, demanded answers. He accused, shouted, threatened, but Violet never faltered. Her silence was her shield. She had learned the art of power without display, of vengeance without evidence. The more he raged, the more powerless he became. In this confrontation, the mansion itself seemed to respond. Candles flickered, doors slammed without wind, and shadows pooled in corners where no light should reach. The father's authority, once absolute, had crumbled in the face of invisible mastery. Violet's calm presence rendered him impotent. Fear, subtle and precise, had overtaken brute force. The children, now fully aware of the invisible hand guiding their world, began to record in their own way, their diaries, their whispered confessions, their secretive glances. Violet encouraged subtle acts of recognition, allowing them to witness justice in a controlled, instructive way. Through them, she ensured that the mansion's corruption would be remembered, that the invisible ledger of cruelty, deception, and moral failure would survive beyond her own acts. They became her allies in observation, her partners in silent reckoning. The mansion had created its own chroniclers, unknowing participants in Violet's carefully orchestrated justice. One humid night, Violet delivered her ultimate course. The family, arrogant and unsuspecting, sat down to a meal that carried the culmination of years of observation and meticulous planning. The flavors were subtle, the effects inevitable. By dawn, the house that had seemed untouchable was silent, the corridors echoing only with the faint traces of vanished lives. Violet walked through the halls, touching nothing, moving unseen, cataloging the aftermath with cold precision. Justice, silent and invisible, had been meted out. The mansion, stripped of pretense and authority, became a monument not to wealth or power, but to the unseen consequences of cruelty ignored. In the months and years that followed, the mansion was abandoned. Locals whispered of the ghost of a small woman in the kitchen, stirring pots that no longer contained food, her eyes observing every intruder. No historian recorded her deeds. No official recognized her justice. And yet, her presence lingered in the shadows, in the fearful hesitation of anyone daring to enter the abandoned home. Violet had become both myth and memory, a specter of retribution for a world that refused to act. Her vengeance was complete, yet it existed outside the laws, outside the histories, outside the eyes of the city that never truly knew her name. New Orleans continued, its streets humming with life, oblivious to the mansion's dark legacy. Yet for those who dared to look closely, whispers remained. Of sudden disappearances, of houses abandoned overnight, of faint traces of justice carried out by an unseen hand. Violet's story became legend in fragments, whispered among servants, noted in diaries, obscured in archives. Her vengeance was a lesson in patience, observation, and the invisible administration of justice. And the city itself, unknowingly shaped by her quiet acts, carried the residue of fear, control, and moral reckoning long after the last dish had cooled. Violet remained in the shadows, a ghost, a teacher, a warning. Power is not always visible, and true justice often comes in silence.